Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Tzadi Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Bubby Jerry and Auntie Audrey in honor of the birth of David Eitan Goldstein, son of Michael and Stacy, born on Shabbat Hagadol. May he grow l'Torah, l'chuppah, u'ma'asim tovim. Okay, we're going to get started today. Before we start, I want to remind everyone that the Menachot challenge is starting tomorrow. So anybody who wants to join or wants to invite others to join, now is the time. Okay, with that, we'll get started. We're in the middle of a sugya. So we ended with this issue of, we're darshaning the psukim about the nesachim, the libations. Okay, we're going to continue to darshan them a lot today. Today is a day full of drashot. And then questions about the drashot. And kind of what needs libations, what doesn't need libations, what's included, what's excluded based on what. And what we were learning is that the animal offerings are excluded. The bird offerings are excluded. They don't need libations. And we get that because it said olah. So then, because it said, according to Rabbi Yoshia, min bakar o min hatzon. Okay, so because it says that was the end of the pasuk about the libations, in Bamidbar chapter 15, verse 3, Vasita milelash olalash ishet lashem olah uzevach lefalei neder o b'nedava o b'moadechem. We darshan the olah, the zevach, the neder or nedava, the moadechem, right? And now we get up to the end of the pasuk. So mina bakaro minatzon. So mina bakaro minatzon means o minatzon or from the tzon. According to Rabbi Yoshia, comes to exclude bird offerings. Comes Rabbi Yonatan and says you don't need to exclude bird offerings, and that pasuk actually teaches you about a pasuk at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra about bringing a voluntary olah offering. And there it said, if you want to bring from an animal, then it said from the bakar and from the tzon. And you might have thought it meant if you want to bring an olah of an animal, it has to be also a bakar, also of tzon, you have to bring two animals. So this comes to teach you, no, min bakar, min tzon, it's either or. To which the Gemara said, and that's where we ended, but according to Rabbi Yonatan, why would you have thought that? He's of the opinion, against Rabbi Yoshia, he's of the opinion that unless it says yachdav, it doesn't mean, when it mentions two things, it means this or that. So why would you have thought in the beginning of Vayikra that it meant this and that? To which the Gemara answers, very end of Tzadi Amabet, Eitzrich, Sal Kadata Chamina, Ho'il Uchtiv Uminatzon, Kiman Dachtiv Yachdav Dami, because it says and minatzon. Okay, and I'm just going to remind you of the pasuk. It says if you want to bring an olah from an animal, and then it says from the bakar, from the tzon, from the cattle, and from the sheep. And then the question is, why didn't it just say if you want to bring from the animal, from the tzon, kind of comma, from the sheep? From the bakar, from the tzon. So it doesn't really need the vav there. Why is the vav there? The vav seems to say that you might have thought, because it's a vav, it means and therefore comes our pasuk to teach you or. Now we go back to Rabbi Yoshia. And as I said before, Rabbi Yoshia disagrees with Rabbi Yonatan about this. Besides about this issue, is it coming to exclude the birds or not? Rabbi Yoshia also disagrees on the issue of Isha Sher Kalel et Aviv Edimo, right? And then there, the assumption is, right, without something else, one of them says you would have thought, Rabbi Yonatan says you wouldn't have thought both of them, but Rabbi Yoshia thinks you would have thought both of them. So the Rabbi Yoshia, even if it doesn't say together, it actually usually means both of them. So he specifically would need the pasuk, right? Everything's counterintuitive here. They're each kind of flipped in their opinion. So you really do need a pasuk to teach you, and yet he teaches this pasuk is coming not to teach you about the pasuk in Vayikra, but it's actually coming to teach you about itself and about the fact that there's no birds, right? Bird offerings don't need libations. So how does he teach about Vayikra? So he says no. Vayikra you can learn from the context there, because Haktiv, it says there, im olah korbano min habakal ve'im minatzon korbano. After it says, if you want to bring from the animal, and then it says from the bakar, and then it says uminatzon, right, and from the sheep. But then it goes on to say, if you bring your korban olah from the bakar, this is what you do. And if you bring it from the tzon, this is what you do. So from the continuation, it makes it pretty clear that they meant either or. So he doesn't need a special pasuk. No. Idach, what's Rabbi Yonatan going to say? It's pretty good proof. Why is he using this pasuk in the middle of Bamidbar to teach you about the one in the beginning of Vayikra? But in general, Rabbi Yonatan's approach is quite challenging to understand. Even right in the question they asked about Uminatz on the Vav there, right, where they answered it, also is not the most convincing. So he says, no, Itzrich, Salkadat Hachamina, Hanemile b'mefaresh. You might have thought that when the Torah talks about that there's one son and there's one bakar, but you don't have to do them all together, right? Because it says the psukim that Rabbi Yoshe, we just quoted for him, imola, right? If you're going to do it from the son, if you're going to do it from the bakar, this is how you do it. That might have been when you specify, I want to bring an ola from the bakar, or I want to bring an ola from the tzon. But what if you didn't specify and you just said, I want to bring an ola? You might have thought of al-bistama, you might have thought if I just said I want to bring an ola, maybe you would have to bring from both. Kamashmalan. And that's what our pasuk is coming to teach you. That it could be an ola or a zevach, etc., and then either from the bakar or from the tzon, and then that would teach you that an ola only needs to be one or the other, and that teaches you about that pasuk in Vayikra. Okay, now we're going to go back to the drasha that we mentioned earlier. Amar Mar, Todat Minayin, Talmud Lomar O Zevach. Remember, we darshan that whole pasuk Gimel in chapter 15 of Bamidbar. And when we got to the word O, we said, or Zevach teaches you about the Toda. Whereas the word Zevach taught you about a Shlamim. That a Shlamim needs it, and then a Toda. So Atu Toda lav Zevachu, but isn't Toda just a regular Zevach, and it's really also a Shlamim? So once you say Shlamim needs libations, wouldn't you assume that the Toda would? Well, Itzrich. Sakedat Chamina, you might have thought. Ho'il ve'ika lechem bahada, because there's bread already brought with it, lo tibai nesachim, maybe you don't need libations. Because the libations, right, are partially made up of mincha offerings, and maybe that is its own, you wouldn't need anything in addition. Okay? And therefore, you need to know that no, it also needs its own libations. Umay shname el nazir, di'ika bahade lechem, ubai nesachim. Now, why is it any different from the el nazir? In other words, why would you think, this is only what you thought, you might have thought it doesn't need libations. But why should it be any different from the ayil of the Nazir, which is a shlamim offering? We'll talk all about the different offerings the Nazir brings today. But there, bread comes with it, and it says in the pasuk that it needs libations. We're going to see that later in today's daf. So, if the El Nazir needs libations and has bread, wouldn't you assume then it would be obvious that the Toda would, and then you don't need a pasuk to explain that the Toda needs libations because it's just obvious. Right? Again, it's a zevach, which we already learned from the word zevach. We don't need the word o for that because it's a shlamim. And in addition, right, if you would have said the bread would mean there's no libations, well, the Nazir proves no, it has bread and there's libations. So, salkadat hamina hatam shnei minim hach arba'a minim kamashmalan. In the Nazir, there's only 2 loaves, 2 types of loaves. There's 10 of each, but there's only 2 types of loaves. And in the Toda, there's 4 different types of loaves. So maybe you think that has so much more, maybe it wouldn't need libations. That's why you needed to say, no, it needs libations. Now they say, V'lichta rachmana lefalei neder o b'nedava v'lo bai ola. Why is there ola in that pasuk? If you say neder and nedava, what do we learn from that? Anything that comes as a voluntary offering. But we already have the word ola there, meaning that we really should only use the word neder and nedava. We don't need ola. Ola is something that comes as a voluntary offering. So, it's something that you can say, I'm going to vow to bring this. So, why do you need the word ola in the pasuk? Well, ilo katav rachmana ola hava amina. If you didn't have ola, what would I have thought? Well, it says vasitem ishela Hashem. That's a klal. That's a general principle. And then it says, that's the first words in the pasuk. Then it says, Lefalei neder o b'nedava prat. That's a detail, right? Not any korban, right? First, anything that gets burned. Then it says neder o nedava. And then it ends with l'reach nichach, which is anything that gives a pleasing aroma, any sacrifice. So, chazar v'kalal. That's again a general term. Kalal upratu klal, iet adan elakena prat. What's the rule when you have a specific and a general? It only goes according to the detail, the middle one. So, ma prat, now how would you define a neder or nedava? You would say, ma prat meforash davar she'eno ba'al chet, af kol she'eno ba'al chet. You would have just said, well, neder and nedava is something that doesn't come for a sin. So what am I going to exclude? I'm going to bring everything else, but just exclude things just exclude korbanot that are brought for a sin, like the chata and the yasham. So tzich chatat v'asham shehem ba'in al chet. So I would exclude just those two. And what wouldn't I exclude? Avi b'chor u'maaser u'pesach shehem ba'in al chet. I would then say the firstborn, the maaser, the 10th animal, and the pesach all would need libations because they're not coming for a sin either. Amud lomar ola. That's why you need the word ola to say no. Only a korban ola, and that limits, and not the pesach, maaser, and bechor. So now they say, okay, so if you're going to say that, hasha dechtiv ola, klalu prat, my merabit be. Well, then what do you do with the klalu prat? If the ola comes to say not only the things that are not coming for sin, but even other ones are excluded. So what is the klalu prat coming to include? Ma prat meforash davar she'eno mechuyav ve'omed, af kol she'eno mechuyav ve'omed. What is the prat? It's something that you're not obligated for from the start. So anything that you're not obligated for from the beginning, meaning, again, it's a voluntary, it came from a voluntary offering. So it's not something that was right away from, when it was born, an obligation. Lahavi, what would that include? Well, vladot kodashim utmuratan, the vlad of an offering. So now we're going to say that if an offering, let's say I bring a neder, I promise to bring an animal, and then, or I say harei alai, okay, let's do it where I committed to bring this particular animal, and then, harei zo, I said this animal, harei zo, that's what I meant to say, not harei alai, harei zo, this animal is going to be, that's a nedava, this animal is going to be offered, and then the animal gave birth. Now, it's true the animal that it gave birth to was not one that I designated as a voluntary offering, so it's not included in the simple neder or nedava. But it did come on account of a voluntary offering, and it wasn't mechuyav ve'omed. It wasn't like an obligation from the beginning, although this is from the beginning of its life, but not because it was meant to be an offering, just because it happened to be born to this animal that was sanctified. Or the tmura. If I said, I'm going to replace this animal with a different one, which I'm not allowed to do, but if I do, the second one becomes sanctified as well, that one also needs libation. So there's all these korbanot, also the vlad of a sanctified animal, has to be brought as an offering and needs libations. That's what we get from here. Ve'ola haba min hamotahot, ve'asham shenitak l'riyah. These are two similar things. And ola that comes from extra money. If I designated money for an offering and then I had extra money left, and then I bring with that money a korban ola, or an asham. It was a korban asham, but it was, let's say I brought another one in its place and then found the original one. Let's say I lost it, I brought another one instead. Then when I brought the original, I have to sacrifice that original one. So what do I do though? But I can't sacrifice it. So what do? I leave it to graze because it's not a voluntary offering. I leave it to graze. And then I redeem the animal. Once it gets a blemish, I redeem it and I take the money and I buy an ola. So all these offerings, the ola that comes from the motarot, the asham shenitak l'riyah, which turns into an ola, and kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman, if I did them not for the sake of the right offering, but have to bring them anyway. These are kind of all kinds of sacrifices end up having to be brought anyway. Well, they have to come with libations as well. And that's what the klalu pratu klal teaches you. Now they say, if we already, and now we're going to have a lot of drashot in the rest of this daf about the word o, or. Okay, we already learned toda is learned from the o zevach. Hashid amart o lidrasha. So since we already said that we could darshan the o of o zevach, so lefalei neder o benidava lamali lechalkam. Why does it have to say neder or nidava? From here we're going to go on a long slew of drashot that are all going to be the same type of thing, each one kind of changing one parameter each time. I mentioned once like the game set where you have 3 colors and different shapes and different sizes and different numbers, not sizes, different shapes, different fillings, and each time you change one parameter, that's really what we're going to do here. So we're going to have all build up and learn it from different words, mostly in this one pasuk and pasuk gimel, but then we're going to jump actually to pasuk ched as well. So lefalei b'neder o b'nedava, why do we have the o in the middle? Itzrich, you need it. Why? You might have thought that until you bring a neder and a nidava, maybe you don't need libations. Kamash malan da'aite neder lechude libayin nisachim. Because it says, if you had said lefalei neder unidava, you might have thought you need both. So it needed to tell you neder or nidava so that you know it's Either a neder or a nedava already obligates you in libations. Hanicha Rabbi Yoshia. Okay, well that fits with Rabbi Yoshia, who basically says, if it says yachdav, right? Remember, he said, even if it doesn't say yachdav, we assume they go together, and that you would need both. So then you need the O to teach you otherwise. Ela Rabbi Yonatan lamali, but to Rabbi Yonatan, what are we going to do with that? In other words, what Rabbi Yonatan thinks that unless you said yachdav, it definitely doesn't mean both, so you wouldn't have had this thought. Well, salkada tachamina aite neder lechude libayin nesachim, aite nedava lechude bayin nesachim. Okay, we're just getting started here, but you would have thought that if you bring a neder on its own, you need libations. If you bring a nedava on its own, you bring libations. That's because he thinks, even if I said neder and nedava, it would mean neder or nedava. Okay, so far that's just obvious. But aite neder unedava tiskale b'nesachim decha. But you might have thought that if I brought a neder and a nedava, I would bring one libation for both. Okay, and that's really where we're going to get started on this whole long-winded line of drashas. Ka mashmalan. So the O, according to Rabbi Yonatan, teaches you that it's not that if you bring a neder and a nedava, you have to bring separate libations for each. And now we're going to have all sorts of examples where we're going to have a word O or something that teaches you another case where you might have thought, where we change a parameter here, you might have thought you bring one libation for both. No, it teaches you have to bring separate ones for each. So here's the next one. O b'moadechem. Okay, so now before we darshan the neder and nedava, now we're darshaning the O. Then we darshan the b'moadechem, that it was holiday offerings and libations, but now we're going to say, what do we do with the word O? Lamali. Salkadata chamina hanimile. Okay, what we just said a minute ago, that if you bring a neder and a nedava, you have to bring separate libations for each. That's the kamaite ola b'neder u'shlamim b'nedava. Maybe that's only if you bring a korban ola as a neder, and you promise to bring a korban shlamim as a nedava, where each one is a different type of korban. And that's why you would have to bring separate libations for each. Or inami ibcha, right? Either ola is the neder, shlam is the nedava, or the reverse, it doesn't matter. Aval hecha de kamaite ola u'shlamim b'neder, but you might have thought that if I bring an ola and a shlamim as a neder, two different types of sacrifices, but both as a neder, not that the nedava was one and the neder was one, but that they were both a neder, an ola and a shlamim. Inami ola shlamim b'nedava, or I promise to bring an ola and a shlamim as a nedava offering each. Right now, shem neder achad, shem nedava achad. Since they're both neder or they're both nedava, maybe I would have thought maybe one libation for both would be enough because they're both in the same category of neder or nedava. Kamash malan o b'moadechem. O and the moadechem comes to teach you, no, there's an additional case that needs libations, meaning each one needs its own libation, even though they're both nedarim, because one's ola, one's shlamim. Okay. Going on to the next. V'chi ta'aseh ben bakar ola o zevach. Now we're going to have another pasuk which talks about ola o zevach, and it's in pasuk chet there, where it's talking with the psukim then go on to do is they talk about what amounts of wine you're supposed to bring for libations, and it goes again into, if you remember, like we had before, with the oil, the amount of oil is like the wine. If it's a sheep, the kevis, it's 3 log, right? Revi'irahin. If it's an ayil, a ram, which is the older sheep, right? The sheep in its second year, you have to bring 4 log, and if it's the bull, you have to bring 6 log. So same amount of wine, and that's all described here in the Psukim. So now they say, why does it say in the Pasuk, when it's talking about if you bring a ben bakar, which is the par, right, anything from the cattle family, ola o zevach, lamali, why did I say they're in ola or a zevach? It's drich salkadat achamina, so what do you need it for? You would have thought, hanimile, what we just said a minute ago about if you bring an ola and a shlamim and a neder, you need separate libations. If you bring an ola, shlamim, and a dava, you need separate libations for each. Hanimile heradikamaite ola ushlamim beneder, inami ola ushlamim benedava, like we just said, an ola and a shlamim is neder, an ola and shlamim is a nedava, right? Or aval heradikamaite shtei olot. Now we're changing another parameter here. What if I say I'm bringing 2 olas? Chada beneder b'chada benedava. We're switching. Instead of bringing ola and shlamim as a neder, we're now bringing ola. 2 olas, but one is a neder, one is a nedava. So now you might say inami or possibly shnei shlamim, echad b'neder or echad b'nedava, where you say bring a peace offering, one a neder, one a nedava. Ein Hashem shlamim achati. Right? Instead of saying before it was all a neder, it was all a nedava. Here we're going to say it's all shlamim or it's all ola. Shem ola achati. V'tizke b'nesachim dechad, and maybe it's enough to bring one set of libations. Kamash malan. No, that's why you need the ola o zevach in that second pasuk in pasuk chet to teach you. Keeping on in that pasuk lifalei. Okay, it also says there. Here's the whole pasuk. V'chi taseh ben bakar ola o zevach lifalei neder o shlamim laHashem, to express a vow or shlamim to God. So what's this O again? Lifalei neder o shlamim lamali. Salkadat hachamina hanimilei chademaiti shtei olot chad b'neder v'chad b'nedava. Well, that's because you brought two olot. One is a neder, one is a nedava. Or inam yishlei shlamim chad b'neder chad b'nedava. That was the previous case. Aval hecha dekamaite. Now we're going to get to what if you have two olot b'neder or shtei olot b'nedava. Inam yishnei shlamim b'neder or shnei shlamim b'nedava. You have everything's the same. You have two olot, both as a neder, or you have two shlamim, both as a nedava, or any of those permutations. So Shem ola achati v'shem neder achadu. And then you have, it's all a neder and it's all a shlamim. Or it's all a neder and it's all an ola. So maybe then, tizkele b'nesachim dechad. Kam mashmalan. That's what lefalei neder o shlamim comes to teach you. Also that case needs its own libations. Okay, we're almost done here, but we have two more. Because now we have to go back to Rabbi Yoshi. I wanted to mention it when I said at the beginning, I forgot. After we had the Rabbi Yonatan, Rabbi Yoshi discussion at the very beginning of our daf about mina bakar u'minatzon, which comes to teach you specifically about according to Rabbi Yoshi, comes to teach you no birds, right? The bird ones don't need libations. And according to Rabbi Yonatan, it specifically came to teach you about vayikra, when you bring an ola in general. It can be either bakar or tzon. But what we didn't really explain according to Rabbi Yoshia is if it's to teach you about birds, why does it say O in that pasuk? What's the O doing there? Right? It could just say mina bakar o minatzon. Why need the O? So Rabbi Yoshia, hi mina bakar o minatzon lamali. What does he do with the O there? Sal kadat achamina hanimile b'trei mine ava b'cha mina tizkele b'nesachim dechad. Maybe that's all an ola. Let's say two olot with as a neder, but maybe it's only if you're bringing two olot that are the same type of animal, both cattle, okay, from the cattle family. But bechad, right? No, maybe so. Maybe you would think that when we said you have to bring two separate libations, is because you were bringing two different types. One was from the sheep family, and one was from the cattle family. But you might have thought bechad mina tizkele b'nesachim dechad. If you bring two olot as a neder, and you're bringing them both from the same type of animal, then maybe you really would only bring one libations. Kamash malan. Again, same thing. This O in the neder, the mina bakar o minatzon, comes to teach you even those need their own libations, right? Even if you brought the same type. Okay, one more pasuk here, one last drasha here. Now we're skipping down to pasuk Yud Aleph. Okay, we're going to come back to this pasuk, but right now they're saying, one second. Actually, it's not this one. It's a different pasuk. We're going to get back to that pasuk at the end of the daf, but it's another pasuk that sounds very similar. It's the next pasuk. Ki mispal asher ta'asu, according to this amount that we just specified, exactly how many of what amount of libations you're supposed to do. Kacha ta'asu le'echad kimisparam. This is like what you should do like this to each one according to its number. So what does that mean? Okay, that by the way sounds exactly like what we've been saying. Each korban needs its own one, and that's what they're going to say here. Sakadat achamina hanimile. Now what's left? We basically talked about all the possibilities. Well, there's one more thing that they didn't talk about, which is timing. Maybe all that when you have to bring separate libations is bizeh charzeh. When you brought them one after the other. Aval bevat echad tizkele b'nesachim dechad. But maybe if you brought, let's say, our last case, two olot of the same type of animal, all at the right, and both as a neder, and you bring them at the exact same time, maybe you would only need one libation? No. Kamash malan. Okay, therefore that last one comes to teach you, do to each one. Everyone gets its own libation. Okay, so that was a very long-winded way to say that every korban that needs a libation gets its own libation. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next section. Ella shechatato shel mitzora v'ashamota unisachim. This was in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said the chatat and the asham of the leper needs libations. Okay, this is nice. This is our parsha this week, Tazria Mitzora. We're going to learn all about the leper. So now today we're going to deal a little bit with the leper and learn about the sacrifices the leper brings. Now a leper who's wealthy brings 3 sacrifices. He has to bring 2 kvasim and a kivsa, and we have one is an ola, one is an asham, and one is a chatat. So now we're learning that the ola anyway needs libations, and even the chatat and the asham, even though no other chatat and asham needs libations, but this one does. Minane mile, where do we get it from? Okay, good question. Titanu Rabbanan, as the Braita says, Ushlosha esronim solet mincha. So it says you're supposed to bring with, this is in the leper pasuk, with the korban of the leper, Shlosha esronim solet mincha. You're supposed to bring 3 esronim solet mincha. So this mincha must be the mincha that goes with the zevach. So then they say, meaning basically, right now they're assuming that means these 3 esronim go together now with kvasim. Do you remember how many esronim for the kvasim? 1. And there's 3 korbanot and 3 esronim, so it makes sense that this is telling you 3 esronim, 1 per korban, which means the chatat and the asham are going to get libations. So now they say, wait a minute. Okay, like a classic midrash halacha kind of braita. Are you sure? Maybe it's just telling you there's a special mincha korban you bring if you're a leper, like the mincha de omer has its own mincha. Okay, it also has libations, right? Those are 2 different things. Maybe it's just telling you about a mincha. Well, it says in the psukim there, the kohen offers the ola and the mincha. Sounds like the mincha goes together with the ola. So so it seems pretty clear it's the mincha that goes with the offering, and therefore again the 3 esronim divide up into the 3 korbanot. Now they say, well, but I don't know if it needs wine libations. So they're going to learn now, how do we know it needs wine libations? Talmud Lomar, instead of quoting a pasuk from Mitzora, from that parsha, they're going to quote a pasuk from the Parshat Nesachim, again, darshaning the psukim about the libations. V'yayin l'nesach revi'i tahin ta'aseh la'olah o lazevach lekeves ha'echad. Okay, for each sheep you bring yayin l'nesach revi'i tahin. Now, you already know those numbers from, well, not already, because this is chapter 15 in Bamidbar, but later in Bamidbar in 28, that's when it talks about all the numbers, how much you need for libations for the sheep. So why is it repeating this? Again, it's repeating it earlier, but there's no order in the Torah specifically when they talk, like, say, well, we know it says it there, so why does it say it here also? So now they're going to say, okay, let's read the pasuk again. Yayin l'nesach revi'i tahin. Okay, this is in Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 5. Ta'aseh al ha'olah o lezavach lekeves ha'echad. So we're going to darshan now this olah o zavach, 3 words. We're going to darshan them to tell you. Olah. Okay, now, until now, all we really saw, even though I told you 3 esronim and it makes sense to divide them up, but really we only saw the mincha going with the olah. So now they're going to say, and maybe even you say there the isaron goes as a mincha for the chatat nasham. But we're trying to figure out, how do we know there's wine? So they say in the pasuk about the wine libations, it specifically has a reference to those 3 in those words. Olah o zevach. Zevach zo chatat mitzorah. Sorry, I skipped olah. Olah zo olah mitzorah. Zavach zo chatat mitzorah. O la zavach zo asha mitzorah. So we have 3 drashot here. The olah is the olah mitzorah. The o is the asham, and the zevach is the chatat. So now they have a bunch of questions on these 3 drashot. Okay, first, typically travayim zevach. Okay, why are we learning one from zevach and one from o zevach? Why don't we just learn both of them? It's actually zavach, but anyway, why don't we just learn both of them for the word zavach? Now, why would we think we could do that? Turning out on the bet to Amar Mar, because in a similar situation about a nazir, where the nazir also brings a chatat nasham. Okay, it's a little different because the leper always brings a chatat and nasham and an olah. The nazir brings an olah, a shlamim, and a chatat. When does he bring an asham? Well, he only brings an asham if he broke his nizirut by, let's say he became impure to a dead body. Then he has to redo his nizirut from the beginning, and then instead of bringing the sin offering, the chatat, he brings the asham, the guilt offering. So, in any case, not any nazir necessarily brings both of these, but there are two korbanot called the chatat and asham that go with a nazir depending on the scenario. Again, chatat when the person finishes becoming their nizirut, and the asham. So there it talks about a different thing, which is it says that you're supposed to burn the hair of the nazir under the fire that's under the zevach hashlamim, that you're burning the shlamim offering. But it says zevach shlamim, and there they learn the chatav ashaminai. And how do you know that you could also burn the hair under the burning, in the fire where the meat of the asham and chatat are also burning? How do we know that? Talmud lomar zevach. So what do you see here? The word zevach includes chatat and asham. So why doesn't it include it previously? Right, in the other, in our section, in the Mitzorah, why do we need the O for the Asham? Why couldn't we just learn it from Zevach? So, Hanimile, hechad et chavayu ki adadininu. Aval hechad Asham lahachshir v'chatat lechaper be'inan trei cry. This is very interesting, especially since it's our Parsha this week. Think about the process that the Mitzorah goes through. So, in the Nazir process, the Asham and the Chatat have the same kind of function. They're both functioning lahachshir, to permit something that was forbidden. So when you finish your nizirut, you bring the chatat, and that permits the nazir to drink wine, to become impure of the dead, etc. Right? Cut his hair. When you're talking about the asham, it's to permit the nazir to start counting again after they became impure. But when it comes to the Mitzorah, the leper, the chatat and the asham have different purposes. And that's why the main point being, we'll explain their different purposes in a minute, but the main point is if they have different purposes, well, you can't learn them both from the same word. If they have the same role or similar type role as a machshir, they're permitting something, then we can put them together. If they have different roles, then no. So let's talk about what they do. Asham lahachshir, according to the Gemara. Asham comes lahachshir. The asham comes, what does it do? Well, the leper has to go outside of 3 camps. They can't come back in until they bring an asham. So they actually do a part on the first day with the birds, and that kind of allows them to come back in because they have to go back in to be able to get into the temple, because part of the ceremony is the temple. But the asham is where they put the blood on the ear and the finger and the toes. Remember that whole thing? So that actually permits the leper to come into the temple. Okay, it allows the leper back in completely into the community. The chata comes to atone, l'chapel. Okay, l'chaper on what? Well, the assumption is that a Mitzorah did sins, and that's what caused the person to become a leper. There's 7 sins listed in a Gemara that say these are the sins the leper did. Although there's a bit of a question there because some of the commentaries raise this issue, which is, what do you mean? It says somewhere else that the sins come to, the suffering of the leper, the sickness, the disease is actually what atones. Other people say that the chatat is there actually to permit sacrifices to be brought, or to permit the leper to eat sacrificial meat, which they can't do. So either which way, it's something, or that's a bit of a question then, because that's not really l'chaper. But our Gemara seems to say that the chatat is coming l'chaper because it has a different purpose. You can't learn them both from the same word. And again, that's just interesting because it teaches us about what's the nature of those sacrifices. Now we're going to move to the other drasha, zavach, zo chatat mitzorah. So now we have a slew of questions on this. So the zavach is telling you, this is the chatat of the mitzorah, it needs libations. Ve'ema zo chatat asham de nazir. Now, the asham and the nazir we know don't need libations, but why isn't that the drasha? If we're going to include something, maybe we'll include the chatat and the asham of the nazir instead of the chatat of the mitzorah. Lo salkadatach. It doesn't make sense to say that Titania, because by the nazir it says, umin chatam v'nizkehem. Now, where it says min chatam v'nizkehem, the drasha is that's talking about the ola and the shlamim, not the chatat and the asham. So then the Braita asks again, classic midrash halacha, you sure? Atal omer bo'olato b'shlamav oeinu ela afilu chatat. Maybe it's also the sin offering. Well, Talmud Lamal et ha'ayil yaseh zevach shlamim umin chato v'nizko. There's another pasuk which says, bring the ram, which is the shlamim offering, and offer it as a shlamim offering with its mincha and with its libations. Now, ayil b'chlal ayav lama yatsa. Now, We already know that every ayil that's brought, especially as a shlamim, any ram that's brought as a shlamim offering, we already know it needs libations. That's the ayil needs, right, 4 esronim, 2 esronim and 4 log of oil, right? We already know it needs libations. So why was it specified that it needs libations? Lama yatsa, and also the wine. So why did they tell you specifically in this pasuk if we already know it's going to need? Lahakish elav, to make a juxtaposition and say, Ma ayil miyucha ba b'neder u'nidava, av kol ba b'neder u'nidava. What makes an ayil unique, this ayil shlamim? It's a neder, it's a voluntary offering. So all offerings that are voluntary offerings, which exclude the chatat and the asham of the nazir. Okay. Ola, another question on the drasha. Now we go back to the drasha about the ola. Ola zo olat mitzorah. So now they say, why are we assuming that it's including the ola of a leper? Ve'ema zola olat yoledet. Maybe it's coming to say the ola of the yoledet, of the woman who gives birth and has to bring an ola. Maybe it's coming to say that ola needs libations and not the mitzorah. So Amar Abaye, olat yoledet misefa dekra nafka. The olat yoledet is learned from the end of that pasuk. What's the end of that pasuk? Titania. Okay, what pasuk were we in? Remember, we're in the pasuk of. Sorry, I'm just finding it. We're in pasuk. Hey, yain lenesach revi'itahin ta'aseh al ha'ola o lezavach lekeves ha'echad, to the one sheep. Okay, so what's this keves ha'echad? Rabbi Natan omer lekeves zo olat yoledet, because the yoledet brings a keves, and meaning that the olat yoledet needs libation. So now we're going to see that's why we don't learn from the word ola to the ola of yoledet, because ola must be the mitzorah, since the yoledet is already learned from the word lekeves. What's ha'echad? That comes to teach about a different case, which is a bit of an ironic case, which we're going to see right now. Zeh achad asar shel ma'asel shekarev shlamim. Okay, the 11th animal of the animal tithes. Okay, that's weird. The 10th one is the one. Well, if I'm miscounting while I do, so what do? We have the animals go out of the pen and I number them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If by accident, when I get to number 9, I said 10, and then I realize my mistake, and then when 10 comes out, I go back and I say, okay, that's 9. And then I forget that I already did 10 and I do 10 just by rote, right? We always make those kind of mistakes. And I call 11 10. In that case, all 3 are sanctified. 9 because I called it 10. 11 because I called it 10. And 10 because it was actually the 10th, even though I called it 9. And each one is a different law. The law of the 11th one is that it's brought sacrifices as shlamim. The 10th is the real maaser. The 9th has a different law, which we're not going to talk about now. The 11th is brought as a korban shlamim. Now, this 11th one that's brought as shlamim, from the word ha'echad, echad referencing 11, al-chadasar, okay, 11, which is, it needs libations, even though we learned maaser doesn't need libations. But shalom atzinu la b'chol Torah. In other words, this is a special drasha because we don't have any other situation in the Torah. She'ehei tafel chamor min ha'ikar. That the tafel, the secondary one, which is this accidental one, the 11th, is actually going to be more stringent than the 10th, because the 10th doesn't get libations, but the 11th does. And that's because it's brought as shlamim, and that's because of this drasha, ha'echad comes to include that case. Okay, so that was answer number 1 to why we didn't say olat yoledet, and that's because olat yoledet was up for the word keves. Then we got to ha'echad just because we were in that bright. Rava Amal, he gives a different answer. Ezehu davar shetzarich shlosha ribuyim hevei omer ze mitzorah. He says we're going to learn ola to the mitzorah, to the ola of the mitzorah, because these are 3 words that go together. Ola, o, zavach. Each one comes for one of 3 korbanot of a leper. The yoledet is just 1 korban, and we look at these 3 words as 1 unit, and where else do we have 3 korbanot other than this leper? And that's why it's obvious it's talking about the leper and not about the woman giving birth. Okay, now we're going to move on to another pasuk. La'aya lamali. Okay, it then says, in pasuk vav, okay, right after lekeves ha'echad, we're now on the next pasuk. O la'ayel, another O we're going to get to in a minute. Okay, if you bring an ayil, then you have to bring a mincha with 2 esronim and with a shlishit of oil. Now, it says la'ayil lamali. Why do we need to talk about this ayil? First of all, we already learned the ayil again in Bamidbar, chapter 28. So why do we say this? Amar Rav Sheshet lerabot elo shel Aharon. To tell you there's an extra ayil that we might not have thought gets libations. We'll talk about why not in a minute. Which is on Yom Kippur. the Kohen Gadol brings his own 2 korbanot, a par lechatat and an ayil le'olah. So his ayil is going to get libations. But what do we learn from the Moadechem? It's one of those holiday offerings, and the holiday offerings get libations. We already learned that from Moadechem in yesterday's stuff. They say, that's a little different. Those are communal offerings. This is an individual's offering. It's Aaron's offering. So then they say, wait, what? You think olas of individuals don't get libations? Why is it any different than the olah of a yoledet, who's an individual and she has to bring libations? So why would you think Aaron would be any different? And this is all to tell you why we need a drasha for this. You might have thought maybe libations are only brought for things that don't have a set time. This one has a set time. It has to be brought on Yom Kippur. So maybe that would only be if it's Moadechem, if it's a holiday offering for the community and not for an individual. So that's why you need la'ayil to teach you also that ayil is going to get libations. Oh, la'ayil amali. What's the O for? L'rabot et ha'palgas. Okay, what's a palgas? Well, we learned that a keves is within its first year, the sheep, and the second year, the 2-year-old sheep and more is an ayil. But we didn't say the whole story because the month after it becomes a year old, it's in its second year, from month 12 to month 13 of the animal's life, they're not called an ayil and they're not called a keves, they're called a palgas. So now they're going to say, if I say I'm going to bring a palgas to the temple, and I do, I have to bring it with libations also. Okay, even though it's not a keves and it's not an ayil, and I actually have to bring it, why is it? It's included in the ayil. I have to bring it exactly in the amount that the ayil has to bring. Okay, 2 esronim, 4 log of shemen, 4 log of wine. Now, hanicha, this only really fits though, li Rabbi Yochanan, de Amar Briyahu. Rabbi Yochanan says that a palgas is a bria, is its own unique thing. It's not a keves, it's not an ayil, it's its own unique thing, and that's why I need a drasha to include it, because I wouldn't know where to put it. Okay, but, and therefore you need that. How do we know that he holds this? Okay, we're now going to say, because ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah in Parah, he krivo, okay, what if I offered to bring a keves or an ayil, one of them, not a palgas, and then I brought a palgas instead. If I sacrificed it, mevi alav niske ayil ve'eno olelo mizivcho. I use this for the libations, and as I have to bring the libations of an ayil, and it doesn't fulfill my obligation though, because I said a keves or an ayil, and now I brought a palgas. So that doesn't work. But I bring it anyway because I sacrificed it, so I have to bring it with libations, and I bring the libations of the ayil. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ol ayil l'rabot et ha'palgas. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Ol ayil comes to include a palgas, and therefore this all fits very well. But Ela leBarpada da'amar maite umatne desfekahu. But Barpada said, it's not a bria, it's a suffix. The reason why we call this a palgas is because we're not sure, is it a keves, is it an ayil? And that 1 month period is kind of in between. It's no man's land. So now we're nowhere's land. We don't know where this sheep falls. So what do? We bring it and we say, I'm bringing the ayil, the larger amount, the libations for the ayil, but if it's supposed to be like a sheep, then the extra will just be like a donation to the temple. Okay? So now, what's the problem according to this? Well, itzrich chalari buye sveika, and therefore vadala barpada kashya. This really doesn't work according to barpada. So what does this mean? Well, you don't have a drasha to include a case which is a doubt. Case of doubt, we always have rules. What do? Case of doubt, be stringent. Okay, but we don't need a pasuk to tell you, oh, this includes this category of sveikot. No, it's that the Torah has no doubts. Torah knows what the halachas are. We as humans need, have doubts. But we're not going to say there was a word in the Torah written to how to grapple with the fact that we don't know where to put this animal. So then that drasha makes no sense. And in fact, they say it doesn't really work according to Barpad. Okay, last section for today. Kacha yaseh. We're now going to darshan in this other pasuk. It's pasuk. Sorry, trying to find it. Okay, pasuk yud aleph in that same section in Bamidbar chapter 15. Kacha yaseh l'shor ha'echad, ye'aseh l'shor ha'echad, o la'ayil ha'echad, o l'seba kvasim, o be'izim. We have 4 phrases here. To one shore, to one eye, or the one shore, the one ayil, the seh from the sheep, and the goats. Okay, so now we have to figure out what this means. L'shor ha'echad. We're going to darshan these 4 sections all in the same way. What's this coming for? Matamud lamar. L'fisha matzinu shachilek ha'katuv ben niskei ayil l'niskei keves. Well, since we have a differentiation between the 1-year sheep and the 2-year sheep, in terms of how much libations you're supposed to bring, yachol nechalek ben niskei par l'niskei egel. Maybe if you have a bull versus a baby, right, a calf, maybe you would have a differentiation there also. Same thing. A newborn calf is not going to bring the same libations as a par. Talmud Lomar l'shor ha'echad. That's why it says to the one bull to say no. In the cattle family, it's all the same. Doesn't matter what age they are. Ola ayil, matamud lamal. What's the ayil for there? The ola ayil. Fisha matzil again. This isn't the same ola ayil we saw before. There's a different one. And it's really ola ayil ha'echad. Well, we already differentiate between 1 year and 2 year because keves and ayil. Maybe you would think once the ayil reaches 3 years, the 3rd year, maybe you have to bring even more libations. No, there's the same rule for all the ayils. Okay, it doesn't matter how old they are. What's this coming to teach you? Well, keep going back to this. So there's a differentiation of age between the 1 year and the 2 year sheep and ram. Those are the males. Maybe on the female side of the sheep, a sheep is a kifsa 1st year. It's called a rechela in its 2nd year. Maybe we differentiate the amount of libations there too. Talmud lamar ola sebek fasim. No, it's always going to be treated like a sheep, like the keves. Even the rechela, even though she's older, it's going to be the same amount of libations for the sheep. O ba'izim, last one, the fishe, matzinu shachilek ketub ben niskei keves l'niskei ayil, echon nechalek ben niskei gedil l'nichsei seir. Maybe we'll differentiate between the kid, baby goat, and the full-grown goat. Talmud lamal, o ba'izim. O ba'izim can tell you, no, there's no differentiation. And with this, we finish our daf. So maybe not the most interesting daf, but what we did here is we darshaned all the psukim about the libations to try to explain which ones are included, what needs libations, what doesn't need libations. We saw the Metzorah, all the korban of the leper need libations, even though usually the Chata and the Yashem don't. We saw the drasha where we get it from. We had all the different why we need a special word O for the Toda because of the breads. We saw, Neder Onidava, what we get out of that, and Ola, why we need them both. And that was to include this Vlad Kodshim and all sorts of other cases. Then we had the O. We started with all those drashot about what all the O's are coming for, and we basically said they're all coming to say, don't think that if you have 2 similar things, we're going to bring 1 libation for each. Every single case, you're going to have to bring separate libations for each one when you're obligated. When we had then we had the Zeb, we had all the drashot about the Metzorah, and then we said, why didn't we darshan other things? We had a slew of questions about that, and then said why it's obvious we're darshaning those and not anything else. And then we finished with this pasuk about the ayil, and about the Eloshel Aharon, and then the O to include the Palgas, and then we ended with all that last pasuk about the Shor Ha'echad, and the Ayil Ha'echad, the Sebek Fasim and the Yizim, to say the only differentiations between the Keves and the Ayil in terms of quantity. All the other animals, doesn't matter their age or their size. And with that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day.